my colleague Nicole Maliotakis for putting this press conference together. The reason why we're here is, once again, unfortunately, after 65 years, we have to, you know, I love this because, you know, if we travel to Cuba now, and you and I would go, I mean, they will not let me in, but they will let you in. And you will not be able to come close, this close to the Capitol, and speak your mind and have a dialogue like we could be having right now, because they will either put you in jail or put you back on a plane back to Miami or something. So, well, yeah. So we're advocating right now for
this is not your press conference. Can you move a little bit, please? Can you all move, please?
But all I'm saying is that I wish the average Cuban would have the same privilege that you're having right now.
Well, thank you for giving us the privilege to be here.
Listen, you can move that way, but
You just said that we have the privilege right
but this
here.
is our press conference. Please move away a little bit. Please
But you
respectfully
see,
move away.
this is exactly what we want for Cuba. This type of freedom that anyone can bring with a poster, stand right in front of the Capitol, and be able to talk to elected officials like we are and express their thoughts. That is what we want for Cuba. But unfortunately, these two ladies do not know what really happens on that island. That the Castro regime is a snake that bites and injects venom into people's veins whenever they can. Whether it is the elected officials that go, like some of our colleagues that just went last week, or people like them, or the poor Cuban people. And that's why we're here, because we're demanding the Biden administration to open their eyes and to understand that unfortunately, regardless what you want to do, you want to be good, you want to be kind, if you really want to include the Cuban regime into the international community, like President Obama did a few years ago, the Cuban regime will always bite you back, because they are in the business of power, and they do not want to give you any of the market share of the power that they have been holding for 65 years. So, we are here to denounce what's still happening in Cuba. We are asking the Biden administration not to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist countries, because they are terrorists and they are terrorizing their own population. I, Maria Salazar, the representative of District Number 27, the heart of the Cuban exile community, people that love their islands, people that are separated, that their families right now are crying. They're desperate because they can't go, the others cannot come. It's a major mess for the Cuban population because of the Cuban regime. So number one, we're asking the Biden administration not to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist countries, because that's what they are, and if they were to do so, all they're going to do is give them oxygen, economic oxygen, to the Castro regime. And number two, send a message to our colleagues here in the Capitol, people who are elected officials who just went to Cuba, and to make them understand. No, you can come on the other side. No, but not among them. But you can go next to her. You can go next to her. Of course. We don't do like the Cubans do. You can be right over there. But let me tell you, you're Colombia, right? Yeah. Good. Let me tell you something. If you were to go, si tú vas a Cuba ahora y haces eso mismo que estás haciendo delante de una conferencia de prensa que haga 10 años, lo primero que van a hacer es meterte en una cosa que se llama Villa María. Y ahí te van a interrogar y te van a decir quién te mandó. Seguramente te mandó el imperialismo, seguramente te mandó Mario, o te mandó María, o te mandó Carlos. Lo que pasa es que esta belleza que tú estás haciendo aquí y que nosotros te estamos respetando, no se puede hacer en Cuba. Y yo estoy segura que tú estás de acuerdo, ¿verdad? Que esto mismo que tú estás haciendo aquí, el cubano promedio lo necesita y lo merece. ¿Estás de acuerdo? El cubano promedio que vive en Cuba necesita y merece lo que tú estás haciendo aquí en los Estados Unidos. ¿Sí o no?
Necesita y merece que se levante el bloqueo.
No. All right, so, you know, so we have to go, so otherwise I will continue the dialogue. Bottom line, bottom line, we want for the Cubans the same thing we have. This. We want freedom, we want liberty, we want human rights, we want free market economy. And we just don't have it. So we're sending Biden administration that message, and to the colleagues who just went to Cuba, to open their eyes, not to drink the Kool-Aid, and not to negotiate with a snake. Because once again I say, the Cuban regime is a snake that will bite you every time you come close and inject venom into your veins to kill you. Because they want to preserve the business of power. I thank you very much. Now tengo que decirlo en español. Muchas gracias a mi compañera Nicoma de Ataques. Gracias a todos ustedes por estar aquí. Estamos en el Capitolio, un día precioso, cerca, al lado del poder de la democracia en este país, para denunciar nuevamente lo que está haciendo el régimen, el comunismo en Cuba, el régimen de los Castros. ¿Qué es lo que está haciendo? Está haciendo, como siempre, tratando de suprimir las libertades del cubano promedio. Estamos aquí para pedir dos cosas: que no quiten a Cuba de la lista de países terroristas, y que nuestros compañeros que acaban de venir de la isla, compañeros que son elected officials, que también son congresistas, que fueron a reunirse con Díaz-Canel, que entiendan que se están tomando el Kool-Aid, que no piensen que los cubanos verdaderamente tienen buenas intenciones, que el régimen castrista lo único que es una serpiente, que lo único que quiere hacer es morderte y meterte en las venas veneno para que te mueras mientras que ellos se mantienen en el poder, porque ese es el único negocio en el que están, en el del poder, no para darle al resto de la población cubana ningún tipo de beneficios. Ese es nuestro mensaje. Hablamos después si ustedes quieren, y le voy a dar la oportunidad ahora a Toma de Ataque a Mario. Thank you.
Gracias, Maria. Buenos días. Good morning. Thank you all for being here in freedom, where you can express your opinions, and that's why we are always okay with folks who have a different point of view, even if they are consistently on the sides of the enemies of the United States. We live in freedom. A group of our colleagues recently went to Cuba. It's interesting, they didn't announce it to anybody, they don't have it. And among the messages that they brought back was to try to remove the regime off the state sponsor of terrorism. Why is the regime on the state sponsor of terrorism? Because it is, according to law, a state sponsor of terrorism. They harbor fugitives from American law, including cop killers. They, by the way, are now training troops. They are trained in Belarus, Cuban troops by Belarus military, even to fight for Russia in Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. That regime is a close ally of every U.S. adversary and of every rogue regime, whether it's communist China, Iran, North Korea, you name it. They were caught even attempting to smuggle 240 tons of weapons illicitly, illegally, into North Korea, another terrorist regime. And I can go on and on and on. I can also go on about Mr. Manuel Rocha, who was admitted to spying for the regime for decades. Or how about the other convicted spy, Ana Belén Montes, one of the most damaging individuals as far as espionage against the United States, who potentially is even responsible for the death of an American hero. And we can go on and on about why it is on the list of state-sponsored terrorism. So, our colleagues obviously have the right to go wherever they want to go. But the fact that their message is not to demand freedom, elections, for the regime to stop helping terrorist groups and rogue nations around the country. Their demand was not to have to turn over to U.S. authority those who have been living a high life in Cuba, harbored by the terrorist regime, who are on the most wanted list by the United States. No, the request is to once again ask for things that the regime wants in order to help itself stay into power. And let's be very, very clear. At least these individuals that went are consistent. They were among a relatively small number who even voted against a resolution by our Democratic colleague, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, condemning the crackdown of innocent people, including, by the way, minors, who have been sentenced to decades in prison in Cuba for the simple act of peacefully asking for freedom. What these ladies do here, because here we do have the freedom to do, except that in this case, they have condemned them, including minors, to decades of prison sentences for the simple act of peacefully asking for freedom. So respectfully, but vigorously, we ask our colleagues to not be blinded, to follow the facts, and to not be a useful idiot of a regime that is a state sponsor of terrorism 90 miles away and that has not had free and democratic elections in over 6 decades. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes por estar acá. Ustedes saben que un grupo de colegas del Congreso de los Estados Unidos, un grupo pequeño, un grupo que consistentemente se expresa para ayudar al régimen terrorista de La Habana, que hasta votan en contra de resoluciones que condenan a la represión del pueblo cubano. Ellos fueron a Cuba, lo hicieron relativamente secretamente, es interesante, la prensa, como ustedes son los que lo descubrieron, y el recado que trajeron de regreso fue que quieren quitar a la tiranía de la lista de estados terroristas. ¿Pero por qué la tiranía cubana está en la lista de estados terroristas? Porque es un régimen terrorista, según la ley de los Estados Unidos. Porque consistentemente actúa contra los intereses de los Estados Unidos. Obviamente también en contra de los intereses de su propio pueblo. Porque consistentemente, agresivamente agrede a los intereses de los Estados Unidos. Porque coopera con los otros grupos y estados terroristas a través del mundo. Porque mantiene en la isla a fugitivos de la ley de los Estados Unidos, incluyendo a individuos que estaban aquí en la cárcel por asesinar, por matar a un policía norteamericano. Por eso y muchas otras razones es que está en la lista de Estados Unidos. Nuestros colegas no regresaron a insistir, después de su visita, que el pueblo cubano se merece elecciones libres, no. Para insistir que ese régimen no ayude y que no esté entrenando, que no hayan tropas cubanas entrenándose en Bielorrusia para ayudar a luchar en contra de Ucrania a favor de la invasión de Rusia. No, no regresaron exigiendo la libertad de los presos políticos, no. Regresaron con un mensaje que es consistente con lo que siempre han hecho estos individuos. Ayudar, asistir, darle aliento y apoyo a este Estado terrorista a 90 millas de los Estados Unidos, que hace más de 6 décadas no tiene elecciones libres, ni prensa libre, ni sindicatos independientes libres. Así que le agradecemos a todos ustedes que estén acá. Y lo que estos individuos que están haciendo aquí, que nosotros les damos la bienvenida, aunque discrepamos obviamente con la actitud que ellos tienen de siempre ayudar a los enemigos de los Estados Unidos, pero en una democracia lo pueden hacer. Y lo que nosotros estamos solamente exigiendo es que se respeten los derechos humanos en Cuba, que se den cuenta de por qué está en la lista de estados terroristas y que cesen de ayudar a ese estado terrorista. Ahora, let me now leave you with, Congresswoman Maltakis, who is one of the amazing freedom fighters in this process, who has seen firsthand what oppressed people have had to suffer, because she represents individuals who don't talk about the situation on the island, who don't demonstrate in favor of the terrorist regime, but who have suffered from the repression and the murderous regime 90 miles from the United States.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Nicole Malagatakis from New York City, represent Staten Island and Southern Brooklyn. I'm the daughter of a Cuban refugee, and like my colleagues behind me, our families were destroyed by communism. Our families were torn apart by the Castro regime. My grandfather's gas stations were seized from him. My mother fled with my grandmother and came here. She never saw her father again. That's what communism does. It destroys. Let's be clear about that. Now, should Cuba remain on this list of state-sponsored terrorism? And why are we offended by members of the Socialist Squad who are clear communist sympathizers for making a trip to Cuba, not to meet with the people, but to actually meet with the communist regime that destroyed our families? Why? Because they harbor terrorists. They harbor FALN terrorists, including terrorists that killed New Yorkers in Francis Tavern. They harbor cop killers. You know the name Joanne Chesimard, killed a New Jersey state trooper. They are allowing communist China and Russia to operate spy bases 90 miles from our shores. They support Iran, who supports Hamas, who supports Hezbollah, who I know our friends here were just here not that long ago supporting. All right? That's the reality of what communist Cuba does. Not to mention that they helped make other nations in the South communist. Venezuela is a perfect example. So instead of standing here protesting our press conference, you should be at the southern border, or maybe standing at the other side of the ocean where we're seeing Cubans fleeing in makeshift rafts. And maybe you could learn about what is actually happening in communist Cuba, because you're using a privilege that we only have here in the United States that the Cuban people do not have. And as my colleague said, you will be jailed, you will be beaten, you will be killed if you do what you're doing right here, protesting in freedom, if you do it in Cuba. So it's ironic that we stand here with signs supporting a communist regime that does all those things. It's a shame, really. But I thank you all for being here, and we will continue to fight the communist sympathizers who are walking in the halls of Congress today and are siding with all these terrible regimes in anti-American countries that only seek to destroy us. Thank you. My good friend, Carlos, he was probably, he actually is my best friend in Congress, and we share a similar story. Also, he's from Miami, and he's the only Cuban-born member of the United States Congress. I'd like to introduce my good friend, Carlos Jimenez.
Thank you, Nicole, and certainly a privilege for me to be here. And Nicole is right. I thank God every single day that my mother and father brought me here to the United States and the land of the people, where I can actually, I have freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to speak, freedom of religion, freedom to elect whoever I want, vote for whoever I want. And I was brought here when I was almost 7 years old. And I wholeheartedly, I'm in favor and in agreement with everything that's been said so far. I'm here to protest what Representative Yaya Powell and Representative Omar did, try to secretly go to Cuba, talk to the regime that has been oppressing my people for over 64 years. A regime that has basically destroyed the island. Cuba used to be the jewel of the Caribbean, and now you have millions of people that have fled the island. Many of them had to jump on makeshift rafts just to get out of Cuba. Now, whenever you have a country that doesn't allow its people to freely travel out of the country, that should give you an indication that there's something wrong in that country. And yet these two representatives travel to Cuba to try to lift an embargo. An embargo that is there to put pressure on the regime to have free and democratic elections, and also to lift them from the list of sponsors of states of terrorism. Cuba, without a doubt, is a sponsor of state terrorism. Today, there are Cuban mercenaries that are fighting for the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine, trying to deny the freedom to the Ukrainians that the Cubans also are denied. All I ask them is to take a look around. When you're there, why don't you just take a look around, and then
see if that's what you want to bring to the United States. Because Cuba is kind of frozen in time in 1959. The buildings are deteriorating, the infrastructure is deteriorating, the people have no right to have the jobs that they want. Cuba is also not only a state sponsor of terrorism, but they're also involved in modern day slavery. They sell the services of their doctors around the world. But these doctors don't get the benefit of the fruit of their labors. Actually, 90% of their salaries are actually taken by the Cuban government for their purposes. And to make sure that the doctors don't leave and stay where they're assigned to, the Cuban families aren't allowed to go with them. That's the Cuba that Representative Omar and Representative Yahya Powell, are trying to support. And as a Cuban-born member of Congress, somebody who's been dealing with the issue of Cuba since I was 7 years old, I strongly disagree with what they did, and I strongly urge the Biden administration not to lift any sanctions or to take them off the list of a terrorist nation. So I'll say a couple of words in Spanish. Como el único miembro del Congreso que nació en Cuba, yo le doy gracias todos los días a mi padre y a mi madre por traerme aquí a los Estados Unidos y la libertad. Yo no puedo creer y estoy muy ofendido por el viaje que tuvieron la representante Yahya Powell y Omar a Cuba, tratándose secreto para ver en qué manera ellos podían ayudar al régimen que ha oprimido a mi pueblo por 64 años, a tratar de ver en qué manera le pueden ayudar a ese pueblo. Los Estados Unidos tiene que defender los principios de la libertad, de la democracia, no solamente en nuestro hemisferio, no solamente en Cuba, no solamente en Venezuela, no solamente en Nicaragua, pero en todo el mundo. Y que hay representantes de este gobierno, de este Congreso, que vayan a Cuba para ayudar un régimen que no ha tenido elecciones libres en más de 64 años, es increíble para mí. Y enseña que están completamente equivocados, que no saben lo que están hablando, no saben lo que están haciendo, o si no, saben muy bien lo que están haciendo y están tratando de traer ese sistema a este país. Y ahí es donde yo voy a decir que no. Porque nosotros vinimos aquí, a los Estados Unidos, para la libertad. Y voy a luchar con todo lo que tengo para asegurar que mis niños y mis nietos vivan en un país que es libre, elecciones libres y no debajo de una dictadura como lo tenemos en Cuba, en Venezuela y en Nicaragua. Muchas gracias y que Dios los bendiga.